Hi guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Scooter Face podcast. Today we're talking all about attack surface management, IT controls and defence in depth. Why have I plucked them three silos, them concepts, out of thin air? Well, it's exactly that. They are kind of seen as separate silos. Why? Why are they seen like that? And is it a risk to be seen as three entirely different concepts? And are the strongest of organisations actually knitting the three together? Well, I'm hoping that my guest today will take us on a journey and actually sort of get under the bonnet as to what that might mean. My guest today is Richard Moore, CISO at 10x Bank, but who better than to give an introduction to himself than Richard himself? So, Richard, thank you very much for coming on the Scooter Space podcast.
No worries. Hi. As you said, I'm the CISO at 10x Banking. I've been with the business for about 5 years now, and I've had a few different roles: security director, running our SDLC controls, that kind of thing. And we are a bit of a strange organisation. We're a cloud-native banking platform, but we're not actually a bank. So what we provide is the infrastructure to run a bank on, and it's, as I say, all cloud native. There's no legacy tech in there, and that means that we've been able to do a lot of things in a greenfield way, so we don't have to worry about historical anomalies, that kind of thing. That's let us do some interesting things, but like anything, that also has its downsides, there's weaknesses. It's been an interesting journey. So
Fantastic. And what about pre 10x then? Where have you been?
So I've done a number of roles. I started off as a developer, writing software, and then I moved more into writing software to do security testing, and then built out more of a sort of security knowledge, more security background, and then sort of extended that into pen testing, consultancy, and then ultimately advising people on things like secure development life cycles and how to integrate security into their business, into their processes. And that's very much sort of what I'm doing these days, but just sort of within a single organization now.
Fantastic. Obviously, so that will kind of, I'm sure all that experience will come through obviously in the next half an hour. Like you say, you've come from rolling up the sleeves, being with the core, development, engineering, and then working your way through the SDLC, moving into testing, moving into security, and then obviously with that experience, you've gone into managerial positions, and then obviously in the CISO position where you are right now. So there's a full breadth of different sorts of experiences I'm sure you'll pull on as we sort of get through this. So, obviously, to kick off then, Richard, working in a cloud-native environment at this moment in time, that in itself will produce a lot of attack surfaces to cover off. Before we jump into giving a question, obviously we are now in an age of all this innovation, this explosion of AI. It's fantastic. We are moving at absolutely supersonic speeds in terms of where we are developing to the day. But with that, with anything, with risk comes reward, vice versa. And essentially, with all this innovation, we are obviously increasing our risk as well, our risk appetite, but then also where we can actually get exposed from. Where I'm going with is obviously our attack surface is getting larger and larger. There's more doors for attackers to get into. So working in a cloud-native environment at this moment in time, is it front and centre of your mind, obviously, whilst you're trying to provide all this infrastructure for banking, that with that innovation comes risk?
Okay, so I think you're right that cloud native environments have a large attack surface, but I think what it changes is how you have to think about the attack surface. So historically, we would think about a perimeter defense. We would have control of all of our data stores. We would have control of everyone who is accessing the computers. Many of the computers would be physically inside a building that we controlled.
Yep.
Over time, we had people start to work remotely. So they would be working remotely, but still connecting in using computers that we control. But the data stores at that point remained within the perimeter. And then we moved to a SaaS model. So at that point, we start to move some of the data stores out onto the internet.
Yep.
And what we've done is made it so we have a much more distributed attack surface. So what we can't do is just do a perimeter defense instead. We need to rely on third parties doing defense of their own component of the platform. So that's where things like compliance comes in. So things like making sure suppliers have ISO certificates, making sure they have things like SOC 2.
Yep.
That in itself isn't enough. That's a good start, but you've got to see what service are they providing, assess the risk that service, sort of the risk to your business of that service, what data are they processing, what access do they have. And this is where we start to think about things like zero trust and using identity as the perimeter. So what you want to do is make it so that there are strong controls on your data, there are strong access controls. Now, that data may be accessible from lots of different places within the cloud.
Yep.
But if the identity is strongly controlled, then by locking down the access to an identity, you're able to provide a replacement structure to what you used to do. So you still do have things like perimeters, but you have lots of them. So like say you have an ingress from the internet, you might have a WAF deployed on it still. You'll still be using TLS. But you won't just have one of those nowadays. You might have lots of them. And all of the third parties that you're working with, you want them to be doing the same thing. So everybody has to have those controls. And where you have some partners where you're working with very closely and you're dealing with particularly sensitive data, that kind of thing, then all of the clouds provide mechanisms by which you can securely connect your cloud to someone else's. So in AWS, a common way of doing that is using private links. So you're able to expose just parts of a service to somebody else and make things available to them without it actually going over the internet. So just because it's in the cloud doesn't mean it's necessarily internet accessible. But what you do need to do is make sure that you have strong control over your identity and access management, because the tokens that are used to identify things, so the STS tokens, are the keys to the kingdom. So if somebody has a token that says they have access to everything, they do have access to everything.
Yes.
And there are controls that you can put in place to restrict that. And that's where we start talking about defense in depth. So like you can put policies to say, oh, only certain accounts can access certain aspects of your data, certain services. You can put in place strong IAM policies. And then there are whole layers of controls you can put on top of this. So you've got SCPs in AWS, which are ways of sort of restricting things across a whole suite of accounts. And it doesn't eliminate the problem. All it does is move the problem. So we're always going to have to defend things. What changes is the mechanisms we have and the technologies that we need to use. So at the moment, that's IAM and everything is built around having a strong understanding of identity.
Yep.
And that is where the IT controls come in, because the IT controls are how you establish that identity. So what does it mean for somebody to be allowed to access things? Well, if you think about Azure and Entra, you use conditional access policies to define that. So, well, they have to be on one of our devices. They have to be signed in. They need to use MFA. They need to be maybe using number matching MFA. All of these controls can be layered on top of each other so that if you don't meet all of those criteria, you're not able to prove your identity, which means that therefore you're not getting the access. And this is how the IT controls form a critical part of the actual attack surface management. That they are the gateway by which somebody says, this is me, and therefore get the access that that person has. So if you're strongly controlling all of those links, then you're in a good place. But of course, you can't control all of those things. Something will go wrong. So what you can't do is say, oh, well, I've got really strong identity and access management, I've got really good login controls, because what will happen is you'll have a vulnerability in some piece of software and someone will steal that token, and then now you've got a problem. So this is why you need defense in depth. So what you can't be doing is just saying, I have one solution. You need to be thinking, well, what if that solution goes wrong? And building layers. And every layer is going to have its failures. But if you layer together, like, say you've got a control that's, 50% effective, and you've got another control that's 50% effective, well, at that point, you're 75% effective.
Yes.
put in another one, and you're starting to get really good controls
Yes.
by layering controls that hopefully they're more than 50% effective. You want a control that's like 90% effective for it to be worth implementing. A bunch of controls that are 90% effective, you're starting to actually get a pretty secure perimeter, even though what you've not done is build just like one big wall.
Yes.
What you've done is build lots of little ones, and then you're monitoring when people are passing through those walls.
Yes. Do you know what? Do you know what was ringing true for me? And active listeners of this podcast will understand that I often bring highly technical examples back into layman's terms so that I can understand it. Who is the man on the street? And my house at the moment, got moved into a new house, and like I say, within a new house, you start implementing new security controls with it, and we need some new gates on our property, because our property is it's got like an access bit that we need to get through. So, but like new gates are expensive, Richard. So like I can't just get them like that. So obviously we've started implementing just little things, because the lock on the gate isn't great. You can just lift it up. So it's like, okay, initially put a back lock on, and then I was speaking to someone that like, oh, why don't you put like pigeon spikes on it? They're an eyesore, but they're effective to stop people climbing over the gate. And then like I've got like I invest in like a security system, so a camera, and it's all these little prevention strategies that I was saying to my wife. It said like, look, before we have to spend a few grand on these big security gates, let's just put these prevention strategies in just to deter people, more and more deterrence, and then you're playing that game of slowly putting it up, and then to put it back into the world that you were saying there, it's that probability, it's 50%, okay, 70%, okay, until we're getting there, you're scaling up the security in line with it. So it was a fantastic point. Where I wanted to just ask you before we moved on from this is, identity isn't new, Richard. Like it's been around for so long, but why is it having another wave of so much activity? Is it AI? Is it something else? And I also kind of want to purposely frame you in the sense of where are we going in the sense of NHI, and then also with, if you're comfortable to go into it, with quantum cryptography as well. Why is identity so hot again?
So I think identity's hot because we've got a couple of different problems. We don't have a single source of truth anymore. We don't have a single register of everyone who should be accessing things. So say you are running a SaaS platform, you might have dozens of different clients. Each one of those has hundreds of employees, possibly over many sites. There is no way for you to know who should and shouldn't have access. So that means that a traditional approach of, oh, well, we'll just do username and password, it doesn't work, because that's part of what you want, but you need to actually devolve the control to the users, or to the companies that are using your service. So each of those has their own identity provider, and you integrate them into your platform. Furthermore, you've got machine identities. They're also very important, because these days we're gluing computer systems together. So AI is an example of that, but there are many others. So if you think about how different computers synchronize over the cloud, these are all machine identities. So again, identity is the sort of common factor, and it's a distributed control. In the past, identity was much more about physical people and about individual humans, and you were looking at identity, but there was a human actually physically present, so you could look at a picture and go, is that person? Nowadays, things are being accessed remotely, and that's a fundamental change. So what you've got to think about is, how can we link identity back to the physical world? And that's where things like MFA come in. So MFA with your mobile phone, like pretty much everybody has their mobile phone. If I asked you now where your phone was, I bet you know exactly where it is. And phones have very good security. They have things like fingerprint sensors, facial recognition, all of these complex biometric controls. So if we're able to link something to your phone links it to your physical person because of the biometrics, then we're able to get a very strong concept that it's really you. So that allows us to achieve non-repudiation without requiring you to sort of sign in a form when you come in the building without requiring you to go into a specific building if you want to access a particular service. So it used to be if you want to access a mainframe, you go into the special locked room and you use the special lock terminal and you access the mainframe. That doesn't really work for modern systems. Say your system is 1,000 miles away,
Yep.
you still need to access it. Say your customers are scattered over like 50 countries, they all need to access it. You can't just have like a front door with a security guard on it. It just doesn't work for the modern world.
And God, I was when you were giving that example, I was trying to think of that case today. You might have seen it recently. I think there was a social engineering / phishing successful attempt where a CEO was on a call with an employee asking for some personal information, and the employee was like, they had a back and forth Zoom call, Teams call, whatever it was, being like, this is the CEO, yeah, I'm going to handle this information, and it wasn't. It was literally an AI related attack, and that's not just your standard sort of phishing email, hi, run down to the and get me some Amazon vouchers. It's gone far beyond that, where it's a back and forth chat. It's matured. You can't, and even then, it's like we're looking at a person here. Or so we think, and they are answering back to me, and we still can't trust it. So that's scary, isn't it?
But that's, I think, where you need mechanisms to, like pre-approved mechanisms to sort of identify people. So if you know, for example, that your systems, your internal communication systems are secured such that you've got strong identity, then rather than just sort of trusting someone because you see them on a Zoom call, like pretty much every company allows Zoom calls with third parties because that's what you need it for. You need to be able to talk to people. Sales guys need to be able to talk to customers. You need to be able to talk to suppliers. It's a general communication mechanism. Now, it's not in itself a trusted mechanism. You need to establish trust separately. So that might be that you require people to be centrally authenticated on Zoom. So if you've got a Zoom contract, then if people are properly officially authenticated, it will say so, and that's one way of doing it. But other ways of doing it are if you have fully internal communication methods, then you can use those to establish that somebody is who they say they are. The deep fake examples that you're giving are only going to get worse, and particularly people like CEOs are often public figures, so they are people who video is available on the internet. People will have seen interviews with them. Something like this would be a potential source of ways you could use that to create a deep fake of me, which is why you can't trust that kind of thing as a proof of identity. You need to do something that is actually designed for that purpose and is a specific control intended to prove identity.
And this relates exactly to what we're speaking about, in the sense of like, because of all this additional where we are moving with innovation, all this extra brand reputation. Yes, CEOs are more of a public figure now. They are like mini celebrities. Like LinkedIn's very active, but just digital media, digital marketing, it is huge, and therefore you put the CEO's face out there. But with that comes the risk, exactly what we're saying. Just to move it ever so slightly, Richard, I just wanted to get under the bonnet on your ways of working, because as we mentioned at the start in your introduction, you've obviously come from the software development, the testing side. So have you always, defense in depth, I imagine, is something that you've always had an appreciation for and something that you've always tried to embed, whereas other CISOs that I've spoke to often have to fight the good fight and be like, yes, secure by design, defense in depth, whichever way you want to look at it. It's not an ideology. An ideology seems to think that it's unrealistic, but it's like most organisations think it's a good idea but can't embed it. Is it something that you've always tried to embed in your workforce throughout your career, or do you disagree with what I say there?
I think CISOs have always wanted to do it, but I think it's not always as easy as all that. It's very easy to say defense in depth. It's very easy to sort of sprinkle a bit of security on something. That doesn't actually make things very secure. I think it really needs to be something where you need the organisation to understand it, and it takes a lot of work and an ongoing work to make the organization have an appreciation, because if you talk to different parts of the organization, the way their role impacts security and security impacts their role varies. So say you're talking to someone in recruitment, then security is about background checks. It's about making sure that the candidate who turns up is the candidate who was interviewed, because it's not always the case.
Yes.
It's about making sure that you've got the right address information, proving rights to work.
Yep.
Those are how security presents itself in that world. Whereas if you're talking to someone in sales, then it's more about, well, we know the customer would like these things, but actually we need to make sure that we're only giving the information they're paying for.
Yeah, and how are they using the data? Yep, for example.
Exactly. Now, what control are we willing to give a prospective customer? What data are we willing to give them in order to turn them into a real customer? So you need to embed it across the organization, but it needs to be presented in a way that is suitable for the different parts of the organization. So they need to understand their role in security and how that comes together to help secure the org.
Yes.
When you talk to engineers as a rule will start with, what are we trying to do? What is the shortest path from A to B?
Yep.
And let's try and do it.
Yep.
And there's nothing wrong with that. But what we need to be doing is thinking, we already know that we have both functional and non-functional requirements.
Yes.
Now, engineers start off with, what are the functional requirements? We need them to also be thinking, what are the non-functionals? So they'll already have an intuitive understanding that if it's so slow as to be unusable, that's probably no good. And we also need them to be thinking, if it's so insecure as to be unusable, that's also no good. So what we need to be doing is elevating the non-functional requirements to the same sort of level we do as functional requirements. So we need to be doing things like, let's do some unit testing. Is it fast enough? Let's do some testing. Like, does the authentication system actually work? Like, can we just trivially bypass it? And once you start to get the idea that these things need to be thought about early, then people are actually quite appreciative of it. So like getting, for example, threat modeling done early in the design phase, something we've done at 10x, and that works very well for us. So we're able to avoid security saying no too much, because what we're able to say is, if you want to do it, fair enough, but these are the things you need to worry about. And by giving the engineers the information of, well, these are the considerations, they're good at finding solutions. So we don't have to say, you must do X. We say, these are the problems you need to have considered and solved. And they then tell us, well, we're proposing this solution. That then means that like they're able to work within a set of guidelines of like, this is the things we need to do. So they don't then have to come to us near the end of the project going, oh, yeah, we meant to involve security, and like, what can we layer on top? Instead, it's been considered as part of the early design, which means that architecturally it tends to be more secure. So there's a much smaller attack surface, to link it back to what we started with, that quite often you can do things in ways where what you expose doesn't have to be a lot of stuff. And that immediately means it's cheaper because we don't have as much stuff to defend. So doing architectural security, doing security early, is a cost save, and it's a way of making it so that we're not trying to sort of
tick a
people
box.
don't tick a box, but also we're not trying to, at the end of a project, when they've spent all the money, suddenly go, oh yeah, and you need to spend 10 grand on a pen test. Oh, and now you need to spend £1,000 more fixing this issue. Oh, and you need to buy one of those to secure this bit. So it's about getting those things well understood at the start. Sometimes that might mean you decide it's not cost effective to take that course of action. Sometimes it might mean you go about the problem in a different way. But it's rare that you can't achieve the business goal unless the business goal is actually one that's just not cost effective when you factor in those wider considerations. It's when you haven't done it early that you get the mismatch between the business and security, because the business doesn't want to be insecure. The business doesn't want to do things that don't make money. The business doesn't want to put itself at risk. So as long as you're articulating those things early enough when the decision is being made, then you can reduce the amount of conflict. There's still an inherent tension between what security wants, which is ideally risk within risk appetite, and what the business wants, which is as much as possible, and what can we do to reduce it so that it reduce the risk so that it is within risk appetite. So sometimes they do want us to say, well, what can we put on top to make it more secure? So there is an inherent tension there, but it doesn't have to be some great gulf, because we're actually all trying to do the same thing.
Final question for you, Richard. It's absolutely flown by, and you put it very, very well then in terms of how we can embed sort of security in development at the start, and it sounds more like excuse me, it's more about an education piece to the boardroom in the sense of like, look, you're doing yourselves a disservice by not doing it this way. But obviously, moving it from security into development, how do we actually knit what we are speaking about today in terms of the SDLC into the internal IT controls into attack surface management? Because as we mentioned right at the start, they're often seen completely separate silos. How can we get them working in unison?
So I think they're all part of a whole. So the SDLC controls are, again, about identity. So yes, you've got things like your vulnerability scanning, you've got your dependency scanning, all that kind of thing. But your dependencies are one of your attack surfaces. So we've got to think about, well, are we going to use some kind of artifactory so that we've got our dependencies are secured and that someone uploading a malicious package isn't going to result in a compromise of our build? You have things like code reviews, PRs. All those controls are reliant on identity, and those are technical controls that rely on the IT stuff working, because if you don't have identity, then you can't do the PR. You're not getting peer reviews of code. Similarly, you want to be able to deploy things. Well, who can deploy it? That's back to the question of identity. That's back to making devices so you know that your developers are using your devices, that the code has gone through your code flows. Making sure that the data stores where the code is stored, the compiled objects, if those get compromised so that someone is uploading a malicious payload, then your deployment system can be totally secure. But if someone's deployed, somebody's changed what's in your repository so that the code is no longer trustworthy or the object file has been modified, you're deploying something malicious through your legitimate deployment mechanism, and you could push it out to your entire organization very quickly. So none of these things can be looked at in isolation, because a failure of any of them can result in impacts to all of them. So let's take the deployment mechanism. Well, how do you deploy your organizational controls? Often you're going to be deploying those through similar or even the same mechanisms as you're deploying other types of code. So like we have a lot of cloud native infrastructure that is organizational. That's all managed to infrastructure as code through build pipelines. So the same controls that they're deploying are also the controls that are defending themselves. And it is lots of layers, but it's also a feedback loop that what you want is a set of interlocking systems, each of which protects the other, and it would result in or require a failure of multiple different controls for things to fail at a sort of global level. So you'll get minor failures, you'll get control failures, but what a control failure in itself shouldn't result in is a failure of your overall security. The fundamental of defense in depth is that controls fail, and your designs and your architecture should accept that and lean into it and go, well, that means we need multiple of them. Because the odds of multiple control failures is a lot lower than the odds of a single control failure, which over time is virtually certain.
Fantastic, and that brings us exactly to time. And Richard, I've really enjoyed today. And again, what you were saying there right at the end, it kind of rings true to what we were saying there about my house analogy, in the sense of like, if someone opened the gate, bang, they're hit with the camera in the face, or they'll be hit with something else with another control. So just because something failed, they might go from 90% secure to 85% secure, but like it's still keeping them out, and that's what it is. With this growing attack surface, how much controls can we put in place? Well, we do it by intermingling with the internal IT controls and the defence in depth. Really well put, Richard, and I've really enjoyed today. So if anybody has any questions for Richard at all, I'll be sure to put his information down below. Get involved in the comments if you do anything different at your organisation. Let's share it. Let's get the community talking about it. And once again, Richard, thank you very much for coming on the Security Space Podcast.